Thanks, Joel, for that very entertaining talk. Our next speaker is credited with developing one of the first groupware systems almost 30 years ago. He's known as a visionary and an innovator in human interface technologies. He'll talk to us about the strategic role of groupware and the role it plays in your organization. I'd like to welcome to the podium the director of the Bootstrap Institute and the father of groupware, Dr. Douglas Engelbart.
I'm going to be sitting down at the terminal and working for much of this. And I'll be using the projection display a lot. So a little later, I think the lights need to be turned off. So take a good look now. And in much of the presentation, I'll be working on this piece of paper that we handed out called the Paradigm Map. Because the main theme I've learned in these 30 years is that in the kinds of futures that Joel was doing a marvelous job of opening up a lot of the avenues and challenges of the future. But if we're going to get there, they're really one of the biggest characteristics that plays an important role in how rapidly and effectively we get to the future is the framework that people view their present and future environment in. And there's a term called paradigm that's been used a lot lately. And many, many years ago, I was just introduced to the term conceptual framework. So in my pursuits, I spent 3 or 4 years in the late 50s and early 60s developing a conceptual framework that would suit my objectives. And I'm going to outline the objectives and that framework a bit. But in the ensuing years, the luck I've had in getting a lot of support from DARPA and being associated with the ARPANET from its inception, and building a system and take it out in industry and the commercial world, and interacting a lot and really witnessing the inertia of changing organizations, and yet also being guided and stimulated immensely by the image of what I felt the potential was going to be. So the stresses introduced when you've got an image that is a little bit farther out than you can convince people of today's environment to do is something else to experience. But the main factor in all of that is the disparity of views you find about what the future is, what the potential is for getting there, how you get there. So let me turn to reduce the lights. I'll sit down here and see if I can fly through the space we've created. I must say that we also have standby slides that if this breaks down we can use. And so this is the title of the presentation we get, and here's a picture of this Bootstrap Paradigm Map. So the Bootstrap term was introduced over 30 years ago in my environment because it says if we've got an extremely challenging objective we're going to tackle, and we need a strategy if it's overwhelming. Well, by 30 years ago, when I published a framework book or paper, it had really become clear to me we've got an immensely challenging thing today to pursue. That today was 20 years ago. And if you see what's happened since then and the kind of pictures Joel has presented for you, you say, yes, it really is challenging. So the sort of highlights about this map, and since this map really sort of encapsulates 30 years of work and an objective I've had for 41 years, that's been my prime pursuit, that's a lot of depth behind each of these boxes. But as far as the paradigm issue kind of concerns, the capability infrastructure idea is very basic, and the augmentation system is a hey, how do you develop the capabilities that in an organization you're motivated about? And you realize that it has to co-evolve. There are many, many factors that are simultaneously evolving, and you have to tend to all of that. So any pragmatic approach has to introduce that. And pretty soon one becomes oriented about saying there are all kinds of avenues to go at. It's terribly complex. what's the most payoff of all the things I can invest in improving my organization? Well, then you say, all right, what are the criteria for good investment, return on investment, etc.? So, all right, a good way to do that was what I'd call the ABC model. So we'll get into that later, and that's primary. So the augmentation system and the ABC model are two very powerful parts of the framework that I bring about. So out of that comes the bootstrapping idea, or a way to portray it. And then in the bootstrapping, it's looking at what set of capabilities would pay off the most to go after intensely. And you have to think over here that if I develop them, how am I going to deploy them? So with that idea in mind, the kinds of capabilities that emerged in my thinking 30 years ago was a certain set of knowledge capabilities among groups distributed in communities and organizations. And so that's really what I was going after when I began to get a good deal of ARPA money in the early 60s. And why through the 60s and 70s we pursued that. In the mid-70s, went out in the commercial world with it, and later into a heavy industry in the aerospace, and actually had some large things happening. The largest single organization was an Air Force directorate that had worldwide responsibility for the communications and computing throughout the the Air Force bases in the world. So we've had significant experience and really matured a system that had at its base, it was client-server based, even with the technologies where the networking wasn't the LAN, but was the wide area kind of internet kind of thing. And we had many of the things that Philippe talked about earlier built in, and a lot of experience in utilizing it. And one of the strange things about it is that we kept running into the paradigm issue, that we were on such a different tack. There wasn't an existing vocabulary by which one could explain to people in simple terms, in terms that were usable then, what we were doing, why the differences we were bringing to the environment were something that you should listen to and take account. So the transition was too large, and there wasn't any really backing up. If there'd been a community this large in those days, it would have been a very, very much different issue and problem. So it's exciting to see this community arrive, and then it's like saying, well, what could I share with you out of those years of experience? Well, the most important thing, as far as I feel I can share with you, is this kind of perception, the paradigms, and a potentially strategy to take into play, to adopt. And it isn't a strategy that many of the individuals can say, well, I'm going to take this strategy, but certainly the impact on organizations, both the vendors, the principal vendor organizations, and the larger of the user organizations, there's a tremendous potential, I feel. So I've got this agenda that, I don't know about Joel's uncle, or his wife's uncle, but I've got this agenda that I really can't quit at until I see some momentum going. So you're likely to see me staggering around in my 80s and 90s too to try to get this thing going. But anyway, you get imbued with a picture of what the world could be. And yes, you can say he's very idealistic, etc. But then I want to point out that the pictures I drew 30 years ago and been following ever since, the evolution is happening along that line. So, hey, it's worth listening. So let me go into some depth now in all of this. And I'll sort of start saying, well, what is the objective that for me I picked on? Well, high-performance organizations is the way I characterize it now. What I began with 40 years ago is saying the world's getting very complex and it's moving faster, so the urgency with which you have to deal with the ever more complex problems is increasing. So urgency and complexity both increasing makes a very hard, that means the difficulty of dealing is getting ever larger. And these are problems, these urgent and complex ones, aren't problems that individuals can really handle by themselves, so it has to be organizations. What can I do? So I happen to get the image about interactive computers, working at displays, sharing work collaboratively among other people on there. And mind you, this was before there was a working computer this side of Cambridge. And so it really says something about sort of the maybe instability or over-idealism of a young guy. But I went to Berkeley and got a PhD and studied computers, and then went to Stanford Research Institute and struggled with that and got a little bit of money to make this study this framework paper, and then was very lucky to be there at the right time when ARPA opened its Information Processing Techniques office in 1963. And so I was getting money from there. But the kind of paradigm, in 1962, I almost got some grant money from a government agency. But the reason they turned it down, well, it's a very interesting topic. But since it's going to involve a lot of complex computer programming, and since you're way out there in Palo Alto where there aren't any available computer programmers, we don't think we'll give you this, grant. So there have been lots of changes happening. So that objective is something I pursued very, very much. And by the 60s, the framework had evolved to say the thing to focus on is a capability infrastructure, that working on isolated capabilities is not going to be the kind of thing, because really there's an infrastructure where capabilities built of lower order capabilities and et cetera, very much like subroutines and subprocedures in computer programming. But humans have these things knit up, and so does organizations. So do organizations. So if you think there's going to be something major done about the capability infrastructure, you don't deal with it particularly well by hitting point solutions in here. So we'll get at that a little bit later. And so we said, all right, capability infrastructure is a very important element. What do we do about that? And so we can say, well, let's talk about this, what I call the augmentation system. Take a look at a bare human being. And it says, all right, suppose I've got this creature here that has interesting properties and capabilities, basically, that you can perceive, you can actuate, you can remember, reason, and a lot of other stuff goes on in the unconscious part of your brain too. But if you take an organism like this that has had no experience at all and plunk him in today's world, absolutely helpless, right? So where does the capability come from? And he said, well, there must be something more to it than that. He says, well, right. So skills and knowledge and training and conditioning and learning and whatever else you want about, as you experience the world, you can build up capability infrastructure. So a very, very, very primitive early humanoids could be developing that, all right? What's more, so you get a more complex, your capability structure can start growing. But what happens then when early societies would start getting some language, methods, and customs and bring in, you can imagine an ever more complex capability infrastructure here. And just think what a huge change when introducing language into that. So that remains in my mind as the single biggest, most effective invention society ever made, that I think of as language. We take it so for granted. All right, so then what would come next? Well, as a society could grow and grow and grow, even without artifacts, quite sophisticated social structures in the human system among very primitive, Bushmen and living in the Kalahari that can pick up and just walk away carrying their whole belongings, have a very sophisticated human system development here like that. But inevitably there became more things built up in the early days through tool systems. Every one of these innovations here would eventually find a coevolutionary impact to adapt over here. And they didn't say, you're bringing fire into my world, you're trying to change me. And it says, no, wait, we can harness that. So you would adapt this side to harness it. And in every case, there was the coevolution of these two parts. And it says, oh, yes. So I began to realize this in about 1961 and says, oh, my God, what am I talking about, augmenting humans, when look at what's already been built up? And I said, well, by the mid-20th century, we had a very sophisticated set of artifacts over here and a highly complex system over here. And you say, oh, I'm going to bring the computer in there, and I'm going to really change it. So it really made me stop, and I almost gave up on this. But then I started realizing that, no, it's something new. There are lots of changes over here you can make, even with all this as big as it was. But the computer would be some kind of innovative sort of perturbation in all of this that could really cause stirs in here and give you a chance to get people to think about new ways to organize the human system side, and maybe you could do something. But then I remembered in the late 50s, when I hadn't had a chance to go after this augmentation, I got a research grant for working on the study of how, if you scale electronic components, what happens to them and what the prospects are for really small miniaturization. And that was a really great lesson for two reasons. The sort of obvious one is that I began to realize that, yes, semiconductors can get very small. And yes, when they run out of gas, because when you scale things down, the quantitative changes Joel mentioned, you start getting qualitative changes. So a transistor is going to stop working at a certain size because it effectively has a particular voltage thing it has to work with, and relative impedances get higher. Oh, but something like field emission could work. But even smaller, you can actually have physical shifts in motion. If you get small enough, that can happen in nanoseconds. So I says, all right, there's bound to be plenty of capacity coming out our ears if the real value of these things comes about. So let me set that aside and assume that the cost and performance of our computer stuff is really going to come there. And what do you do to get ready for it and harness it? So when I looked at this picture here and triggered in my mind what had come about in that scaling, and one of the things in studying that was you could look around in the organic world of organisms and look at lots of examples where the physical size creates qualitative changes in what is practical to call for a design. And in this paper I pointed out that a mosquito can't be designed in the same way you are at all. You know, it couldn't fly. A mosquito our size couldn't even walk. And if we were their size, we'd be in great trouble. And we'd be way, way, way over the design development. It'd be like trying to watch an elephant try to play basketball. You know, their whole thing about the time constants and the strength and the sizes, et cetera, it wouldn't work. And so I gave a talk in 1959 in front of a group of people who were all getting oriented about the miniaturization of semiconductors. And I pointed all this thing out. And one of the examples was saying, you don't generally think about it, but if you're sitting in this room and you look around, and if we suddenly snapped our finger and increased the physical scale by a factor of 10 in every dimensions, and what would happen? And he says, oh, well, gee, all the angles would be the same, the geometry would be the same. You know, I wouldn't even notice, would I? He says, oh, well, if you stop to think about it, cross-sectional areas increase by 100, don't they? And the strength of any member, including your arms and stuff, is basically sort of goes as the area. So everything would be 100 times as strong. My God. Oh, but also the volume goes up by 1,000, 10 by 10 by 10, so you'd be 1,000 times as heavy and only 100 times as strong. So that's like saying if suddenly your body mass, if you weighed 150 pounds now, you'd be weighing 1,500 pounds. Do you think you could stand up? Do you think you can move? Do you think you'd get off the floor where you were because your chair couldn't hold you and it broke? So you realize the qualitative nature just, boom, shifted immensely. But we aren't oriented for thinking about that. So when I looked at this picture here and realized that we grew up just assuming and accepting all the stuff that's in this human system side, and along is going to come something that's going to make a fantastic shift over here in the tool system by orders of magnitude changes in the way we can handle information and knowledge and portray it and manipulate it and actually interact with it, etc. You think large-scale changes induce qualitative results, and no one's sitting here thinking about the qualitative, being ready for it, because we grew up with it. So I said, gee, that's the real problem. So the real thing is the coevolution of this thing, and exploring on this left-hand side for what new configurations in that area are going to let us better harness the right side. And it's not like saying over here on the left side, we are going to impose all this new technology on you because now your productivity will go up and you'll work faster. And he says, hey, wait a minute. for the human purpose of human organizations, there's tremendous gains potential in reorganizing, redesigning, re-architecting, re-evolving, or whatever you want to call it. So just as an organism that had gone along for many years and reached quite a state of perfection, if suddenly in terms of biological evolution time constants, there appeared in there a mutation of a very much more sophisticated nervous system. So what, do you think that that would sort of speed up everything in that worm? Geez, no. You know, they could start finding out there are brand new organs that you could evolve and specializations that you could do to take advantage of that. So that creature would undoubtedly evolve to be a very much different thing to take advantage of that much, much enhanced nervous system. Well, that's a very close analogy to the way I've pictured for many years, that human organizations are getting a nervous system that transcends in scalar change anything we've ever experienced, in the scale of change and also in the short time constant that's happening. So we're saying, all right, it's very important then to look at how these organizations are going to harness and adapt to it. It isn't something like we do business as usual, we keep changing. So let's just keep looking at some of these things and say, all right, so we've talked about an augmentation system in which this whole system, human system, tool system, all are there to augment the human in order to produce the capability infrastructure that an individual or an organization can employ for human purposes. So he says, all right, that's a very important thing. And it's very important to realize that it's the coevolution that we're working on too. And we say the same thing. We're looking at that and say the coevolution of that is our big issue at that. And that one of the things that we really want to concern ourselves with in here is a prominent capability in your infrastructure is the capability for your organization to evolve. Well, that's been a very low-level sort of thing, haphazardly dealt with, etc. But in a time in which things are starting to move and change ever faster rates, the old processes of evolution are just not up to it. So it's time to say, let's really have to take a new look at the process of evolution, the capability for it, and seeing if that's something we can enhance early. So that led to the bootstrapping that says, oh, very important to get oriented about that process of improvement and pursue it effectively. And so that led to bootstrapping, is saying, why not consider augmenting that very early so it could help facilitate the rest of the evolution? That's bootstrapping. See? So the thing about coming about in that. So we're dealing with the coevolution. And then the next issue we would like to look at is just the sort of, well, what's the most payoff? So that's a strategic question of saying, what is the most payoff? And that comes into play very, very much. And so out of that, I say, well, there's any useful strategic investment criteria that are available? And so there didn't seem to be any. And so I said, well, let's go create one. And it evolved into what I call this ABC model. Yes, from the ABC model there like that. So he says, well, all right, let's just go look about it. So one of the things I started saying, let's make a very simple picture about what an organization is, with this tool and human system augmenting to provide a particular capability, infrastructure in that. And this whole organization's way of interacting and producing the world is sort of thus wrapped up into this one thing. So we call, this is the A activity, the thing you go and look at every day. You know, they're taking orders, they're training new employees, they're developing new products, they're making a market scheme, etc. All of this is sort of basic, what I call the A activity work. And that's the thing, that's the one you say, well, how do we improve that capability? Well, one of the things you do is within the organization, you have an activity. So any activity in the organization that's there to improve the capability to do A, let's just categorize it as B. It helps a great deal in developing this strategy. So I say, oh, that's great. So as things are beginning to change much more rapidly in the world, then it's like saying you have to get your B activity beefed up, pay more attention to it. Is your, take your B vitamins or whatever, but is your organization's B activity up to the challenge? So that's interesting. So what I ended up with this bootstrapping thing is 3.5, 4 years ago, my daughter Christina and her husband and I set up this bootstrapping institute, and I left Donald Douglas, where I'd ended up being sold on the acquire, never mind. And because I'm saying, I want to get people, see if I can get them to listen, raise a flag that says bootstrapping, and says, hey people, this is something really worth thinking about seriously. And we ask, very good. Yes, I knock on your door, your organization, and I say, I really have a strategy for how you invest in your improvement. Whom do I talk to that's in charge of the strategy for how best to invest in improvement in your organization? I get that same response. See, it says, oh, so this refines this little picture a little bit to say, well, all right, what obviously is sort of needed is some activity that's there that sort of is there to boost the capability to do B, because B has to be enhanced. You just can't be doing it. You can't, the kind of improvement that the TQM does of saying, boy, just better and better and better and better, keep paring down and improving, that's like climbing the hill that you're on already. And in mathematics, I would say in a multi-dimensional field, I'm trying to do my maximization studies, and I change this, and I keep improving what parameter I want to, and finally I get up to the top of the hill. I've improved all I can. The real danger is, which hill are you climbing that way? So you says, oh, if you don't have some bigger perception of the field of opportunities and possibilities, you can start climbing that hill, and you get to the top and thump your chest, and then you look through the fog and you begin to realize there's one about 4 times as high that you could have been on climbing. So the cost of getting off this hill, getting over there and climbing that hill is large. So for organizations where the time to climb that hill of capability is slow and ponderous, the importance of having as much foresight as it can of understanding that frontier out there of all the configurations of possible new human tool systems and sort of orienting about where we're going to best go. There's no way you can do it by everybody ganged up on the current frontier and moving with it like that. The only way is you've got to set up outposts out there to scout out that area. So who's setting up outposts out there now? Universities can't, because they have to be real, lived-in, real work things. Vendor organizations, hardly. They're just pushing about what the user organizations are going to buy this year in the trend. The user organizations, they've been so lulled into waiting for the vendors to tell them what's good and where to go that they aren't doing it. So there really is a very important crisis in this, that everybody plunging onto a frontier whose horizon is moving away faster than they can move with the old ways of evolution and changing. There really has to be ways in which you reach out and do this. So Groupware is not the answer, but Groupware can produce a very important lever to help the looking out into the future and the conditions and capability to move out and explore it and move the whole wagon train out in that frontier. Groupware can play a very important role. So that's why I went into whatever it is that nowadays people are calling Groupware, is because of that. And so this sort of says, all right, there really is an important way to think about all this. And this is neat. This is so I got ABC model, and here's the way I can characterize it in this sense. So that became an important abstraction, an important way to think. So we realized thinking about capability infrastructure is a very useful conceptual framework. The augmentation system I found is really invaluable. It's these two complex systems, and they can't get all pushed one from the other. They have to co-evolve, and they're going to end up in very different configurations. So how do we start thinking about that space? The ABC model is very important. Well, how so? So he says, all right. If I really want, one of the things I'll talk about later, if there's time, is the problem of navigating to hyperspace. So I just took a wrong turn. and I'll pretend like it was where I meant to go. All right, so that extra bootstrapping leverage, one of them is saying, if the things that C generates to support B happen to be the kinds of new capabilities that can be employed by C itself, you get some bootstrapping. If B in turn is doing things to facilitate and improve the capabilities it hands off to A, if it's the kind it can use too, you get more bootstrapping. And that assumes it can come around here and help C. So it says, okay, there's sort of the important model. And it really is like a return on investment. You invest in A, you get a step function in improvement. If it can improve B also, that means your first derivative of improving the efficiency with which your improvement return investment is used. C is a second derivative and such like that. Yeah, that really is something you look at. So as the years went by, I began to realize there are more and more choices that you can make in your organizations. Real, practical, everyday choices that can play in this to talk about investment. If you're talking about investing money out there in the world and somebody says, hey, there are strategic considerations to weigh when you're investing your money to get compound and multiply compound returns, do you want to listen? And you'd be sure that they really would. So how soon will the paradigm get in organizational improvement, the whole business like that, to start saying, oh, let's talk about that. So I say, the strategic framework I have may not be the best one, but it's a start, so why can't I get in dialogue? So I come back to that question, who's in charge of that strategy in your organization? See? This is, well, And as one CEO said, well, geez, that's all I feel like you've made me feel guilty, because I'm an A guy. I grew up in the A world. I was successful there. I don't know much about B, and what the hell do I know about C? So who is it going to backyard choice? So it's an important kind of thing to do, and that'd be necessary. I should point out that the dynamics of all this is kind of fun to employ, right? So we have the bootstrapping strategy, which you can sort of characterize by this. And one thing I might point out is that if you're a vendor organization and you're vending in to serve the B people out in the world, which most of the vendors here are, and the users that are coming here have a B hat on to saying, what can I get? And sometimes I have a C hat on to say, oh, what can I bring in that makes better what our B guys can do out here? So if you're a vendor and you look at it and you says, hey, a fair share of the products I get are also out there to support capabilities, new capabilities in other organizations. Ho, what if I'm really smart and I start feeding that back in my own organization? So they have a better chance than anybody to bootstrap. But it's also, you find the character of thinking inside of those. They're in the business of producing hardware and software and selling in a marketplace. And the market's the king. And how it goes, even if it zigzags back and forth across the landscape, is a sort of dominating pursuit. Sure, they're not responsible for the hill climbing of the user organizations, but if they turn and look inside and they say, wow, what we might be missing if we start turning our own products and really thinking about it and getting a really accelerating the importance and the learning how to do the B and the C stuff and feed that back to our own organization, so we not only get a lot more efficient in the current marketplace, we get a lot smarter and we can knock on the door of user organizations and say, hey, look, here's all the experience. We're really doing it. We can show you. So one of the other things then to put on the other hat of a user organization and say, in 3 or 4 years, if the momentum starts picking up and the perception within your organization gets to be that, wow, this is very complex. We have to start changing our human system side or some such vocabulary. And, Jesus, well, we ought to ask the vendors. Well, when they come selling us, not now shrink-wrap stuff, because you got to bring humanware in with it to help figure out how to handle all this, unless you've got a terribly effective C and B in your own organization. So you ask them when they're approaching you, hey, show me how you use it. And then you find the paradox that they've been used to having a demo room in which you come and they sit down with some guy who's really skillful. He shows you all about the spreadsheet machine they've got or the CAD system they've got. And you says, no, I meant show me how your organization uses it. So what is your organization if you're a vendor? What are you going to feel like then? You says, oh, well, we use email. Well, we use our object-oriented access thing. I know, but there's all the rest of the change in there. What are you learning? What can you tell us that really how the dynamics in our human systems change? So it's very much of a challenge for everybody. So all right. So if we say, so then we say, in the bootstrapping strategy, what's the very best set of capabilities to go after that will not only have a lot of value at A, but could help B and C if you deploy them appropriately. So I started out in 62 with one set of things in mind about extended collaborative capabilities and such, and that's gotten more and more refined and more true to me, etc. So I give the acronym to that bundle of knowledge capabilities now, because there isn't any other name for it. I call it Kodiak, for Concurrent Development, Integration, and Application of Knowledge. I'll go through some more pictures down here in the Kodiak scheme for showing you what that means. But we're going to isolate and get to some of it, but the term concurrent is really, really critical in this, because we've been doing this. This is the way we've been working for a long time. It's capabilities that already exist. So the important thing here is that if we can augment them significantly, that will have a great deal of value in all three of those layers of what we've been talking about. And so the sort of scheme I go to is say, look, well, here represents an organizational unit of some kind. In one way, you could think of it as an individual with the different domains of activity that occur, or it's a unit of people where those are individual people, or whatever size you want. That's just the way it is. And one of the important things to realize that it's very important for it to interact with the outside world. That's how humans, that's how organizational units deal with. So it's all the time scanning, ingesting, and interacting as part of this knowledge activity, and analyzing, digesting, integrating, collaborating, developing, applying, and reusing. So what we're talking about here is what's the kind of knowledge you can get in from the outside world and deal with, and that basic sort of process of doing that is one of the important parts of all this. And that lots of interaction going on inside of the organization as well as with and the outside. And I sort of ended up isolating three kinds of things. Now, the publication that you have in the proceedings goes into this in more detail about examples of what fits in all of these. But one focus, the key focus of the group in its sense of knowledge is what's its knowledge product, and what's the medium in which that's going to be done. And in any given state of its development, is it in a form and a medium that the rest of the organization, of that organizational unit, can work with easily? And is it easy to pass that off to other organizations when you're done with the product? And is the subsequent modification, evolution of it flexible? Oh, does it bring in, does it incorporate what you should know about the outside world in an associated knowledge base that you have here? And there's a lot of dialogue and interaction going on within the group and between it and others that becomes part of the record, that if that's in a medium, that all of these three kinds of basic bundles are in an effective medium, that you can increase very much the capability for this sort of functionality. So he says, all right, that's a target. And that's where, in the end, we build a system that would really support it. So we want some more things about not only is all that stuff going on, lots of interaction between each of these three things going on concurrently, but it's all of the individuals are concurrently interacting with each other and with these things. So that sense of concurrency and parallel that you've got to support. So he says, all right, that's what the system wants to do. And there's another very important part of the concurrency is that, so you have a fairly sizable organization with all that dynamics going on and this thing working. Well, just sort of think that that organization in a basic way is really a subunit of some larger organization that itself looks the same way, and so on. So he says, oh, and at each layer of this, it's layers are going on concurrently too. So this concurrency in a larger sense of all of the scaled units within units and other units together, and meaning that's the real core knowledge thing that's going on today. You guys are involved in it these 3 days. You're coming out and interacting with the rest of the world and exchanging the knowledge, etc. And you take some back to your organization. And you can just ask yourself, how is that process going to be in 10 years? Is anybody producing or making a direct line so that that's going to be more efficient, so I know what to do with it? How do I collect that information? How do I take it back? How do I integrate it in there? How does that dialogue? And really it represents, too, that there's a lot of dialogue going on between all you guys. That really represents organization dialogue that's much more important than just between you two individuals. So what's going to happen in that? So how much is the facilitation of the process that this group, as a sort of a C-level community, how much of the process of it's going to look different in 10 years? So who's making the picture of that, sort of to build it into the way in which the organizations are going to the frontiers? It's very important. And if I can find the cursor, I can take the next step. And so we've sort of dealt with the Kodiak itself, and a very important sort of thing to deal with here is this global interactivity thing. So he says, well, interoperability. So even if you look at a sizable manufacturing outfit and you look at the different domains that are there and realizing that they have to interoperate. So that means that anything in the dialogue, I mean, the finance people will want to get into the dialogue with the manufacturing, certainly, and the quality people with them, but the quality people in with the design people and with marketing people, etc. And they all will talk to some of the subcontractors or suppliers or customers and interactions. So that network is going on, and you have to have the interoperability. And so here, interoperability doesn't mean, in the past we've done it by transferring hard copy. So we have a lot of interoperable conventions about how I can read your hard copy when I get here, and how I can do something on whatever means I have to create new hard copy to send back to you. But when the medium exchange is not only we send it electronically, but we work with it electronically online, where we've got means to move around very much more rapidly, and that if you refer to something in your last communication to me that's in some other knowledge domain, I don't have to go through some laborious process to get it. I can click on a citation link and get it. Well, that interoperability is quite recognizable. But the next thing is that when I land in the middle of your knowledge domain of that cited thing that may come from whoever knows where, how do I explore the context of the cited passage and study around inside? The conventions for moving around, etc., need to be uniform, or I get lost. I'm suddenly in a village in China with I can't read any signs at all. I don't even know their conventions. So it's that kind of thing. Well, those until we explore more of the frontier to find out what kind of performance levels are there possible for people to get if we set restrictions. For instance, in the lower right side of the screen here, there are arrows that click to say where I can go. I also have other means I can shift into other things on the other screen and get to things very much more directly. But if you have a hypertext world in which it's arrows that steer you around, what do the arrows mean? And it's a very inflexible way for moving in a structured, complex space. So there are going to be things about the conventions for the structuring and the addressing and the moving and the mobility and the viewing we built into our systems that aren't general out there yet, that just add a great deal of value. And if the basic objective of going after high-performance organizations, what you have to be really careful about is you protect the potential for this high-value envelope, that some users in some environments can reach the highest value, that you don't put out a product and a set of conventions which put ceilings on where the capability can go. Admitted that when people first use it, it's hard, you want easy transitions, etc. But the really complex challenge is that you don't make the GUIs and the conventions, etc., so that they really can sell well on the marketplace now because they're easy to use. If you do the wrong kind of things in there, that's to the end of it. So, things like WYSIWYG are terrific, but if that's the only view you're going to have of a document, you're tremendously limited. You can have views that will say, just show you the first line, or the several levels in a hierarchical one. We started using those in the 60s. And they're so valuable that when the WYSIWYG comes out, we kept trying to tell people, hey, that should be just one of the views. And they'd laugh at us, say, because, well, you don't have a bitmap display, so of course you'll say that. But no, the way you can move around and view or get organized and reorganize your document are so much more flexible in other views. The CAD people don't have the thing that it isn't computer-aided drafting anymore. Computer-aided modeling and design. You can see whatever view you want of the model. That should be the way it is for the knowledge structure you represent. So here's what I found in my stint in Donald Douglas, really working with very large programs and getting some pilot utilizations of this augment system we had out there, and getting some horrendously excited people saying, God, this is scalable, and it would support. And did you realize, and they outlined all of this to me, where this circle is like that mandala we just came from, the manufacturing organization that's a prime contractor. And look at the tiers of suppliers and the interactions between them. And the first tier at least do very complex design, so the specifications and interaction of the design is very heavy going back. And it says, all right, if you don't have interoperability throughout that sort of complex domain, look at the lost opportunity cost that you've undergone. So no one is yet developing the picture of that future with what the opportunities are there. They all keep looking at, hey, the gains I can get this year. But you don't know what you're giving up in lost opportunity costs to save a few bucks in what you're investing now. And until we get a framework that sort of includes that, it's not going to be very effective for especially the larger user organizations that get involved in these things. And they just have to be the driver. You can't leave it to the vendor. It's not their business in a marketplace to scout out that area in this sense, like this. They certainly can help sell, but the more the user organizations really get with it, and the vendor organizations could participate very much with them. And so you see a lot of the dynamics going up and down inside of that work like that, the time constants for those now are days or weeks to get some interaction going for some of the things that have to be signed off. So the system we built will let you sign them with your own secret password, and public-private key encryption would send that document, and the Defense Department was willing to accept it for like a year's trial as being the way to sign it. So you can pass things around. And, Dave, I really got lost charging up here and diving into this. What should my target be for wrapping this up? It's 11:46 now. Is Dave Coleman there? He stepped out. Oh, that gives me a free hand. Let's see. We were something like half an hour late, and at least. And me being so oriented about telling you all about my stuff here, I forgot to notice what time I started. Well, when he comes back and stops me, but anyway, this global interoperability sets some very, very important guidelines. Is that David? Can you give me some guideline about when, it's 11:47, when I should wrap it up? Now? All right, as I was saying, an open hyperdocument system here, the paper you can read, seems to be a hyperdocument system was the best way you could support the Kodiak. So multimedia, hypermedia structured, a lot of conventions, so we had lots of learning. We took that system out and just it pounded like crazy and used it in very complex environments, and it's really something that seems inevitable. So, and it needs to be an open system in the end, because people are going to use it in widespread areas. It's going to be the way your spreadsheets are embedded in that, the kinds of action item conventions, etc., that Terry was talking about are going to live within that. The structured argument stuff, it's all going to be part of it. Whether that's built on a relational database that goes into objects or built on the objects, It seems like the merging of those is inevitable. A lot of the characteristics are there, but it needs serious talking, how you deploy it. And so there's a whole thing I talk about getting the C people together as a C community in the paper, which is a very important way in which that C community, anyway, it's a whole strategic thing that's a little bit far out. We've been trying to get it going, that C community could be one of the most advanced outposts out there, doing something really useful, and be supporting all the B units that buy into it with lots of interesting, integrating the knowledge that you gain from all the B activities and providing the new stuff from the integrated, better tools, etc. So that seemed to be the way it is. And this thing would just then sort of move around, continuously around in its environment as the means for the means by which all that bootstrapping would go, and it would sort of, this continuous cycling there is what kind of would, once the bootstrapping gets really started, I see the world going up like that. And if there was ever a world that's getting in a condition that needs a lot more effective ability to handle complexity and urgency, and at least those basic knowledge capabilities to explore and understand and plan and guide through the solutions of our complex things, it's this world we have today. So, all right, I get to retire as soon as the world starts bootstrapping, so please go out and do it. Thank you very much.